Good evening. I'm Pat Callahan. Welcome to News Center Maine's Voice of the Voter Forum on Question 1 on the November ballot. Now, Maine has seen controversial referendums before, but there has never been one that has been expensive as this one, and it's been very hard fought. Question 1 seeks to block construction of a transmission line that would bring hydropower from Canada through Maine into the New England power grid. And the wording of the question is confusing to many. There's been a lot of concern about that. The claims and counterclaims have done little to clear that up. So before we begin sorting things out, let's take a quick look at how we got here. It was 2017 when Central Maine Power put in a bid to build a transmission line to bring excess electricity from Hydro-Quebec to the New England power grid, mostly to be used by Massachusetts. Utilities in New Hampshire got the nod instead, but the following year, regulators in the Granite State rejected the Northern Pass project, and runner-up CMP was now the winner. Most of the CMP proposal would use existing transmission lines to connect to the grid in Lewiston, but a new 53-mile section would have to be cut to connect to Hydro-Quebec's facilities. CMP had purchased or gotten easements for the new section, which was to be a 300-foot wide strip through the forests from the Canadian border to the Forks. It also included a roughly 1-mile section running through state-owned public land. CMP got a permit to cross that land in 2014 during the LePage administration, and then a new one last year from the Mills administration. But neither permit was approved by the legislature, a key dispute still being worked out in court. But the project spun off into a new entity called the New England Clean Energy Connect, or NECEC, got all of its necessary permits from the Maine DEP, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Army Corps of Engineers. Opposition groups have battled the project all the way, saying it will do irreparable harm to the environment and the character of a relatively wild part of Maine. Despite that, work began last spring, clearing the new section, and crews continue cutting trees to make room for new power lines, and about half of that clearing work is already done. A referendum to kill the project was on track to go to voters a year ago, but it was ruled unconstitutional. So opponents crafted a new one and got the needed signatures, which brings us to this year's effort, Question 1. And we are joined tonight by representatives from both sides of this question. For Yes on 1, Adam Cote is an attorney representing the campaign, and former State Senator Tom Saviello, who has been closely involved in the process of getting this referendum on the ballot. And for No on 1, Thorne Dickinson, the president and CEO of NECEC, and Ben Dudley, the director of Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs. Welcome, gentlemen. In this first segment, we're going to be talking about the merits of the corridor. Second segment, we're going to get into that retroactivity question that has flummoxed a lot of people. We'll also have time for closing statements from each of you. So I'll begin with the No on 1 side and ask you, give us in a nutshell, how does Maine benefit from a project that's sending most of its power to other states?
Well, thank you, Pat, for moderating tonight, and thank you, WCHS, for hosting, and thanks for all the people watching at home. Well, the Clean Energy Corridor is a major opportunity to reduce energy prices and bring new clean energy to New England. It's a transmission project that goes from Quebec to Lewiston, Maine, that will bring 1,200 megawatts of new, clean, renewable energy to Maine. It's enough to serve about 90% of Maine's load. Obviously, that energy will serve all of New England, gets deposited right here in Lewiston. The corridor is carefully planned. 2/3 of it is along existing corridors, and 1/3 is through commercial working forest. It will help us meet our clean energy goals and displace more than 3 million metric tons of carbon, which is equivalent to about 700,000 cars off the road every year. It has and will create hundreds of new jobs, and it will provide property tax relief to Lewiston and dozens of other communities along the corridor. And it will bring broadband to some of our most rural communities. Those are real benefits for Mainers. Question 1 has some real dangers, and I know we'll get a chance to talk about those as the night goes on.
Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned the jobs that have been created. Are those the temporary construction jobs to build it, or are there other jobs that go with it once it's complete?
So right now we have 400 Mainers working on this project right now. Every day they let me know that they're worried about this referendum and the possibility of losing their job. Once this project in service, there'll be a few dozen people that will be responsible for maintaining the job, but the University of Southern Maine and London Economics have said the lower energy prices that result from this project create such an economic stimulus that 300 additional jobs will be created throughout Maine.
And go ahead, Vic.
Can I speak at a bit of a higher level about this, sort of what this debate is really about? We're in the midst, really at the beginning of a major energy transition. And what we're seeing is conflict between two separate energy interests. On one hand, you have yesterday's energy producers, fossil fuel energy producers, who are behind question one and seek to stop it, and two companies that are responding to a public policy imperative to bring clean energy into the region. I just want to point out, question one is 97% funded by three of the worst carbon polluters in Maine, three of the worst carbon polluters in the nation. And they're wanting to keep their hold on energy production in New England.
All right, let's get into that. And
Sure.
you ask the question, everybody's getting money from utility interests. Is this about helping Maine, or is it about who's going to make the most money? What's your thinking on this, Tom Saviello?
Well, let's talk about the oil and gas, because my good friend just brought that up. Somehow they forget that Avangrid is also the owner of 6 gas facilities, and in fact they own Maine Gas. So I guess they're one of those dirty oil companies. But let me go a little further. One of the companies that has helped us out is NextEra. NextEra last year got 3 major environmental awards for the efforts they put in to produce renewable energy. In fact, some of the environmental groups that did it said, we're not sure why we're doing this, but they are really doing the job. The renewable energy business is in jeopardy because their own report generated by Central Maine Power shows that the renewable industry will lose $400 million over 15 years. How many of them do you think will still be around during that time? So I've always said, as a volunteer on this project, I'm not being paid to be here or paid to do anything, is that I will take any help I can get, because remember, we're being spent 5 to 1.
Let's not get bogged down too deep on the money. I do want to ask, NECEC got all of its permits, and there's still one in dispute. That's the public land, which we can talk more about. But should we trust the state's process, Adam?
I think part of the state's process is to have a citizens referendum, which is allowed under the Constitution. And one of the big reasons we're here for this citizens referendum is because CMP violated the Maine Constitution by deciding to go over our public lands without getting approval from the legislature. If you look at every piece of this referendum, it involves the Maine legislature. We passed an amendment in Maine in the mid-1990s to have public lands entrusted to the legislature, and if you're going to reduce or substantially alter them, then you need to go to the legislature. And in fact, if we're going to compare apples to apples, Bangor Hydro twice ran transmission lines through public lands in 2008 and 2010. TransCanada did it in 2008 again, and all of them went to the Maine legislature to get approval. One of the reasons we're here has everything to do with CMP trying to skirt those requirements, and we're saying that this is such an important project that it should be reviewed and signed off by the legislature.
Thorne Dickinson, the public land here is about a mile-long stretch. That's in dispute. That's being appealed to the state Supreme Court. Is there an alternative if they say that lease is not valid?
Yeah, there are alternatives. That was something we talked about yesterday in front of the DEP. But I think importantly, I want to address something that Adam said. You know, we followed the same process on this project that 355 other leases have been entered into since 1993. And Maine, other Maine businesses, other individuals, implying that there's something amiss here is a direct attack against the hardworking Mainers, impartial, nonpartisan, that work at the Bureau, that work other regulatory agencies that we hire to make these decisions. This is a project that we believe in the end. The uses on this land are very similar, a transmission line already there, a lot of cutting, and we believe in the end the project will be built on that land.
Tom Saviello, there are conservationists who oppose this corridor, but there are some who support it as well and say, such as the Conservation Law Foundation, that cutting this swath is worth it for the carbon emission reduction that they'll get.
Well, it's interesting that Central Maine Power's had the epiphany now that they were all about greenhouse gases, because if you go back to when I served in the legislature, every bill that we had in front of us that dealt with greenhouse gases, they worked against. In fact, all of a sudden now it's all about greenhouse gases.
But is this project, does it in fact have benefits for the climate?
So simply look at the 3 organizations that recently have come out and supported yes on one. That's the Natural Resources Council of Maine, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and the Sierra Club. And all three of them have made a statement that they do not believe the greenhouse gas calculations that my good friend has described to you, because we had no third-party review. If an environmental impact statement had been done by the Army Corps of Engineers, remember there's two other organizations that permit this, two federal groups, the Department of Energy and the Corps of Engineers. In New Hampshire and in Vermont, an environmental impact statement was done. In Maine, there wasn't. Had we done one, we would have known whether these numbers are real. And let's not also forget our good friend Brownie Carson put a bill in to address this. And they killed it because they didn't want the truth to come out.
Pat, I'd like to respond to the
unfortunately, we have to take a break first, but we will pick up this discussion right after the break. You're watching the News Center Maine Voice of the Voter Forum. Welcome back to the News Center Maine Voice of the Voter Forum on question 1 on next month's ballot. We want to talk a little bit more about the impact on the climate. Ben Dudley, your organization is jobs, clean energy jobs for Maine. What kind of jobs does this create?
Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs. We're a coalition of businesses, labor unions, construction companies, and several noted Maine environmental leaders. And we support it because it will bring such enormous economic impact at the same time reducing climate emissions. I just want to speak a moment about process. The legislature a century ago created the Public Utilities Commission for the express purpose of removing these types of decisions, permitting decisions, away from the political context. 50 years later, they created the Department of Environmental Protection so that environmental laws could be presented in the same sort of depoliticized atmosphere. And here's what the Department of Environmental Protection concluded after 2.5 years of study. They concluded that climate change is the single greatest threat to Maine's natural environment. That's a direct quote from their permitting order. This project is a tremendous leap forward in greenhouse gas reduction, and the permit offered by the Department of Environmental Protection offers what they called an unprecedented level of natural resource protection, whereas question 1 does nothing to enhance wildlife or improve ecosystems, it does nothing to add to state conservation land, and it does nothing to reduce carbon emissions.
Well, I promised we were going to talk about the questions of retroactivity, making retroactive laws. Adam Cody, you're an attorney. Can't the Maine legislature already make changes to laws that exist and that would be considered retroactive? Is that a good interpretation?
Well, they can, and I'm glad you said it, Pat, because CMP's been spending a lot of money to tell people that this referendum actually empowers politicians to do something they've already been able to do for forever. In fact, since 2001, there have been 184 retroactive laws passed in Maine. When Ben was in the legislature, he voted for every one that came before him. When they passed one, the legislature passed one a year or so ago on net energy billing that affected Maine's solar industry. CMP was completely fine with it because they didn't hurt. They weren't losing any money on that. So here, now they're coming forward and they're saying this retroactivity. First, they said it's going to affect people's decks. And then Thorne keeps citing these 300 and some odd leases. 297 of them are for camps, which clearly wouldn't even apply here. They rolled out 2 more, which were debunked by all sorts of media sources. This referendum goes to 2014 because that's when CMP entered into this lease over public lands in violation of the Maine Constitution. And when Thorne says, well, we did all of this right and all of these public servants, I have huge respect for all of the public servants. But the fact of the matter is CMP has had more lobbyists than any other business in Augusta for years.
Well, let me bring Thorne in on this.
I need to respond. He implicated me in that answer, Pat, and I need to respond to that.
Quickly, yeah.
There is no precedent for this kind of retroactivity lawmaking. When I was in the legislature, I voted for retroactive laws that would protect workers, protect conservation easements. I never voted for a law that would undo a $1 billion public infrastructure project and immediately, the moment it was passed, put hundreds of Maine workers out of work. Right on the spot.
And yet the retroactivity here only applies to public lands. Why is that such a problem?
That's not true. The retroactivity provision also applies to any type of transmission project of this kind anywhere in the state back to 2020.
Is that a fair interpretation?
And the only one it's going to affect is the CMP corridor. And And Ben is right that there's never been a billion-dollar project that this has affected, but I will offer for your consideration, there's never been a project this big where a judge had said it's illegal to have them go over part of it. Their DEP permit was under suspension proceedings, and they'd been given notice that there's a citizens referendum. This really gets back to the fact that CMP was so arrogant that they're still throwing money into a project to ruin our environment when there's a very, very substantial likelihood that this project will not happen.
Tom, you've been in the legislature. Is it realistic to expect a 2/3 vote on any transmission line project?
Absolutely, absolutely. At the time I served in the legislature, I actually voted on the Kibbe Mountain expansion, which was one of those 53 miles lines that was going to come in. If they had come in and told us what they were doing in 2014, I served there, they probably would have had a permit, but they didn't do it. They did it behind closed doors. It's illegal. They keep referring to the 1963 I always call it Jackman tie line. That was put in before the constitutional amendment was voted on. The people voted in the state of Maine with 72% of the vote that says we want to put the legislature as trustees for this public land. They need to decide. And Judge Murphy made it very clear that both governors circumvented that process and tried to keep the legislature out of it.
Let's talk about what happens if this project goes forward. You've already agreed, the NECEC has agreed to run some lines under the Kennebec River Gorge. What's the possibility, what's the cost of putting more of it underground?
Well, the first thing, I just want to respond to this idea of some backroot deal. The reality is that we designed a project that was carefully sited to go through working forest and to connect to an existing corridor. And the only way to do that was to go through these public lands without another different project that would have had more environmental impacts. We asked the state, is this something that we could do? The state came back to us after their analysis, which is included in a memo from Andy Cutco about how the process they went through. In the end, they awarded us the lease. That allowed us to put together the rest of the corridor. So, again, it's incredibly frustrating, the misinformation that Tom and Adam partnered up with NextEra, who they somehow have granted as this massive energy and renewable company.
So let's talk about the realistic prospect of running more of it underground and perhaps having less of an impact on the land.
Yeah, we have, from the beginning of this project, the 3 years that we've been here, we took a project that was very good and improved it. One of those things is going under the Kennebec River. The other one is the reduction of the corridor from 150 down to 54 feet. Massive, 14 of the 53 miles are now massive corridors for wildlife to be able to move across. Significant improvements were made in the project by listening to Maine people. We will continue to work with the regulators, if appropriate, to talk about other changes that might need to be made in the project. But right now we're focused with 500 people working on this project on delivering important clean energy, jobs, and economic stimulus for the state.
The only backroom deal in this debate, the only backroom deal as a result of question one was when Adam's firm drafted the language behind question one. They drafted it in a vacuum. They received no public comment before they put it out. It never even saw a public hearing.
We've got about 30 seconds, so I want Adam to respond here.
Well, I don't know which one to respond to first, but let me just say that we did reach out to many in the environmental and the conservation community to make sure that this was drafted appropriately, and it was. And Thorne, when you're talking about the underground cables, let's back up like Ben did earlier. This is because Massachusetts put out bids for energy. They received 43 of them. The first one they chose was in New Hampshire. They were offering New Hampshire $500 million. New Hampshire said, no, that's not good enough. So they turned around and they tried to come here for $250 million because it was cheaper, because they're doing them above ground. Vermont has a shovel-ready project, which is more expensive, which Massachusetts doesn't want to pay for. That one goes underground. Above ground is significantly worse when it comes to climate change because it's susceptible to wildfires and power outages and ice storms.
All right, that's going to be the last word on this. We're going to take a break, back to wrap up our Voice of the Voter Forum on question one right after this. Each panelist will have 1 minute for a closing statement. After a coin toss, we're going to begin with no on one. Thorne Dickinson is the president and CEO of the NECEC.
Years ago, we identified a project to bring clean, renewable energy to New England. We took into account the recommendations of regulatory agencies, environmental leaders, and local communities. The corridor will create and is already creating hundreds of good jobs. It will bring property tax relief to Lewiston and dozens of communities along the corridor. It will connect rural communities to broadband, and it will help us meet our climate goals. This is a good deal for Maine. Now, with this project already underway, we have a question 1, badly written, retroactive law that will harm not just clean energy projects, but future projects. The Bangor Daily News said, if question 1 passes, we'll miss an opportunity to make our energy cleaner and send a message that Maine is not welcome to the investments infrastructure needed to do this essential work. I hope you'll join me in voting no on question 1.
The choice before Maine voters is clear. Do we want to lead on clean energy, creating hundreds of new jobs with significant new benefits for local communities? Or do we want to pass far-reaching, dangerous, and retroactive laws that were written by and for the gas industry? I'd like to underline that the Clean Energy Corridor has received exhaustive scrutiny from the public agencies established to provide impartial, expert fact-finding. Question 1, on the other hand, was written behind closed doors by oil and gas lobbyists with no public input, no careful, independent scrutiny of unintended consequences. In trying to stop the development of the clean energy infrastructure, they created a dangerous, far-reaching, and very confusing question with impacts that are impossible to foresee. So if you're confused by question 1, you're not alone. If these carbon polluters succeed, their industry stands to save $1 billion. And that's at the expense of ratepayers across New England, including right here in Maine. If they succeed, the precedent will be set for our referendum process to be abused in the future in this way.
First of all, let me point out that there will only be 38 jobs after this project is completed. In my area, the biomass industry will be gone. They talk about climate change. I would note to all of you, if you look at the governor's climate change report, nowhere in there is mentioned the New England Clean Energy Collect. When you go to the polls, ask yourself, are the pennies that we're going to get for tearing up our state so good for a foreign country, which is Hydro-Quebec, will make $41 million a month, and a foreign business, Iberdrola, who owns Central Maine Power, will make $5 million per month, as Maine acts as an extension cord for Massachusetts. Last time I checked, we stopped being a colony for Massachusetts in 1820. This is a bad deal for Maine. Vote yes on November 2nd.
This project is a terrible deal for Maine for many reasons. It goes through the upper Kennebec region, which is incredibly important environmentally for the state of Maine. CMP likes to talk about all the benefits we're going to receive from this. They talk about broadband, they talk about heat pumps, electric vehicles. The fact is, an independent study said the average Mainer will receive 9 cents of benefits per month on this. 9 pennies. That's not a lot. Whereas they're making billions of dollars on this, CMP and Hydro-Quebec. They've done a lot to try to confuse people on this. CMP actually recently sent out a flyer saying this is going to affect people's gun rights, Second Amendment rights. They've been doing this all over the place, and it's not accurate. The retroactive provisions are to apply to CMP because they entered into an illegal lease. It's that simple. And CMP cannot be trusted to handle this project. They're the worst rated utility in America right now. They can't handle your bills, and they can't even handle the outages. We are going to have more outages if this happens because they will have to take care of that line before they take care of ours. I'd encourage you to vote yes on 1.
Adam Cody, thank you, and thanks to all of our panelists. That wraps up the broadcast portion of our discussion on question 1, but it continues on our website and social media platforms with fact-checking and analysis, and you'll always find our reporting on this issue there as well. For all of us at News Center Maine, thanks for being with us. I'm Pat Callahan. Good night.